In Part 1 of this series, I use the term conspiracy. In Part 2, I'll attempt to justify my use of that term. How you feel about the existence of such activities will most likely depend on how deeply you understand American history and value her sovereignty as an independent nation. It will also depend on how strongly you embrace the freedoms envied, so far at least, by the rest of the world, to the extent that over the decades scores of thousands have died trying to get here. More significant to me are the hundreds of thousands more who died trying to preserve America, the geographic place, and, more importantly, America, the idea. For those of you who still believe there is not something going on behind the scenes, with little or no reportage by the so-called mainstream media, I offer the following. Educated at Harvard, Carroll Quigley became a professor at Georgetown University. Over the years, Quigley also became a confidant of a number of wealthy and high-ranking officials in government and the private sector. He had access to the workings of a number of otherwise unknown and unpublicized international organizations, the leadership and membership of which were composed of these men. Quigley fell out of favor with the leaders of those organizations over his desire to more broadly publicize their private, behind-the-scenes activities. In 1966, Quigley got his wish with the publication of his monumental, and I do mean monumental, tome, Tragedy and Hope. Perhaps it's just me, but at 1,348 pages of very, very small type, with the exception of the revelations to follow, Tragedy and Hope makes the Atlanta White Pages a far more exciting read. On pages 949 and 950, Quigley outs his former pals, citing from Tragedy and Hope, quote, "This radical right fairy tale, which is now an accepted folk myth in many groups in America, pictured the recent history of the United States in regard to domestic reform and in foreign affairs as a well-organized plot by extreme left-wing elements, operating from the White House itself and controlling all the chief avenues of publicity in the United States, to destroy the American way of life, based on private enterprise, laissez-faire, and isolationism, in behalf of alien ideologies of Russian socialism and British internationalism. This plot, if we are to believe the myth, worked through such avenues of publicity as the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, the Christian Science Monitor and the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's Magazine, and had at its core the wild-eyed and bushy-haired theoreticians of socialist Harvard and the London School of Economics. It was determined to bring the United States into World War II on the side of England, Roosevelt's first love, and the Soviet Russians, his second love, in order to destroy every finer element of American life, and, as part of this consciously planned scheme, invited Japan to attack Pearl Harbor and destroyed Chiang Kai-shek, all the while undermining America's real strength by excessive spending and unbalanced budgets. This myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. There does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network which operates, to some extent, in the way the radical right believes the Communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the Round Table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the Communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years, in the early 1960s, to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have, for much of my life, been close to it and many of its instruments. I have objected, both in the past and recently, to a few of its policies, notably to its belief that England was an Atlantic rather than a European power, and must be allied or even federated with the United States, and must remain isolated from Europe, but in general my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough for it to be known. The Round Table groups have already been mentioned in this book several times, notably in connection with the formation of the British Commonwealth in Chapter 4 and in the discussion of appeasement in Chapter 12. At the risk of some repetition, the story will be summarized here, because the American branch of this organization, sometimes called the Eastern Establishment, has played a very significant role in the history of the United States in the last generation. The Round Table groups were semi-secret discussion and lobbying groups organized by agents of Lord Milner, the dominant trustee of the Rhodes Trust in the 2 decades 1905 through 1925. The original purpose of these groups was to seek to federate the English-speaking world along lines laid down by Cecil Rhodes and William T. Snead, and the money for the organizational work came originally from the Rhodes Trust. By 1915, Round Table groups existed in 7 countries, including England, South Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and a rather loosely organized group in the United States. George Louis Beer, Walter Lippmann, Frank Ediolet, Whitney Shepperton, Thomas W. Lamont, Jerome D. Green, Irwin D. Canham of the Christian Science Monitor, and others. The attitudes of the various groups were coordinated by frequent visits and discussions, and by a well-informed and totally anonymous quarterly magazine, The Round Table, whose first issue appeared in November 1910. This ends the sight of Carroll Quigley's expose of the conspiracy, Tragedy and Hope. One of Quigley's students was Bill Clinton, who spoke these words in his acceptance speech at the 1992 Democrat National Convention. Quote, "As a teenager, I heard John Kennedy's summons to citizenship. And then, as a student at Georgetown, I heard that call clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley, who said to us that America was the greatest nation in history because our people believed in 2 things: that tomorrow can be better than today, and that every one of us has a personal moral responsibility to make it so." Close quote. In 1964, Clinton was one of 2 students out of a class of 100 to get an A in Quigley's class. While his old sidekicks at those Round Table groups and their spin-offs, the Bilderbergers, Council on Foreign Relations, and Trilateral Commission, among others, probably removed Quigley from their A party lists, the rest of us owe Quigley, who died in 1977, a debt of gratitude for those words. If you support the United Nations while at the same time feel your local, state, and federal officials are increasingly out of touch, imagine how otherworldly things would become if the global elites who built and run the UN somehow maneuver the United States into some goofy one world, there, I've said it, government headquartered in Brussels or wherever. In the immortal words of that show business sage Jimmy Durante, you ain't seen nothing yet. Next time we'll get into the specific events and name some of the midwives present at the birth of the United Nations.